The final item of business today is a members' business debate on motion number 2703 in the name of Kenneth-Macintosh on Humankind-index. This debate will be concluded without any questions being put. I'd be grateful if those members who wish to speak in the debate could press the request to speak buttons as soon as possible. And I call on Kenneth-Macintosh to open the debate. You have 7 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. There was a revealing episode during the SQA debacle more than a decade ago now, when Scotland's school examination system almost collapsed. In the midst of this crisis, when a whole cohort of pupils and students feared that they wouldn't get the hires for which they had worked, Scotland's universities turned round and said, "Don't worry, we don't need to see your hires, we'll take the assessment of your teachers." Now, whatever their motivation was in saying so, to me, the striking point was that the universities recognised that what matters is not the hire, not even the grade in the exam, but the ability of the pupils who sat the exam. The exam is simply one way of testing or proving that ability and that potential. But how often do we find that the criteria we use to assess, to moderate and compare actually becomes the goal itself? We need to be very careful about the values we reflect when measuring success, because more often than not, we end up being shaped by that very measurement. At a national and international level, I don't think that lesson has ever been more obvious than in the fallout from the banking crisis. Our society is crying out for a more ethical approach to finance, and yet we still return to the very criteria that got us into trouble in the first place. We promote the chase for AAA credit ratings. Wealth generation becomes an end in itself rather than a means to an end. And we end up promoting the values of greed and selfishness. No one is suggesting that money is not important, but if we only track income or economic measures, then we fail to capture the damaging effects of inequality, the negative impact that lack of status, lack of control, poor neighbourhoods have on so many people's lives. A truly prosperous society needs to value and measure health, happiness, social well-being, relationships, poverty, housing, crime and environment. There are a host of factors which affect our well-being, and if we ignore them, then our social progress and ultimately our happiness will prove elusive. The good news is that both here in Scotland and around the world, a range of alternative and complementary measures are now being developed. Countries as diverse as France and Bhutan have shown the way with government-led initiatives. I was no fan of President Sarkozy, but the work he commissioned by Professor Stiglitz, a name we are more familiar with here in the Scottish Parliament, has given complementary indices of well-being both importance and credibility. Closer to home, our Prime Minister, David Cameron, doesn't talk so much about happiness these days for understandable reasons, but I think he is to be commended for at least beginning the process of collecting the necessary information through household surveys on social well-being. Here in Scotland, the National Performance Framework and Scotland Performs is similarly a positive step in the right direction. Now, without wishing to be overly critical, my main concern is that it is still too focused on quantitative rather than qualitative indicators. And it strikes me that the framework itself has yet to become a practical tool of government. As with much of the work that is going on in other countries, these new indices of well-being do not seem to be used or referred to as an active measurement, and I'm certainly not aware of any decisions here in Scotland which have been changed as a result of the National Performance Framework. And that's just one of the reasons why I was particularly pleased at the work that Oxfam and a host of voluntary sector and other organisations have carried out in producing the Humankind-index. And can I just say at this point, Presiding Officer, that although I'm very pleased to have been given the debate today following my motion on behalf of Oxfam, I'm very conscious that there are several members and colleagues who worked directly on the Humankind-index and who I would like to thank for their contribution, including Patrick Harvey from the Greens, Linda Fabiani from the SNP, and I believe from Labour, my own European colleague David Martin, MEP. I should also clearly give particular thanks to Catherine Trebeck and other colleagues from Oxfam. Presiding Officer, I don't think any of us is saying that we have finally cracked it, that here is the one index that can sum up the human condition. But the point about the Humankind-index is that it is interactive, it is participatory. It goes into our communities. In fact, it goes into our most deprived communities and asks, what is it that affects your well-being? Few of us will have been surprised at the list of measures Oxfam has identified as important to most people. Living in a neighbourhood where you can enjoy going outside, having a clean and healthy environment, feeling that you and those you care about are safe, access to green and wild spaces, community and play areas, having the facilities you need locally, being part of a community, having good transport to get to where you need to go, and being able to access high-quality services. And on what are most or often regarded as harder economic indicators, the Oxfam Humankind-index shows that satisfaction derived from work is one of people's top priorities, not work per se. Security and sufficiency of income are more important to people than just having large amounts of money. The result comes far closer to reflecting our values than the more often quoted but distant and anonymous indicators such as GDP. And I was grateful to the Carnegie Trust for a quote that they circulated ahead of this briefing, ahead of this debate, from Robert Kennedy. He said of GDP, while it is useful, it measures everything except that which makes life worthwhile. Presiding Officer, I am delighted that the Parliament's Economy, Energy and Tourism Committee is now looking or considering alternative and complementary measures of prosperity and well-being. Glasgow's Centre for Population Health is doing pioneering work in this area. And later this evening, the Parliament's Scottish Futures Forum is hosting a discussion on the same issue. Scotland is already leading the way, but we could do more. Oxfam's Humankind-index shows us the way. I would ask the Minister to look again at the National Performance Framework. Can it be reformed? Can the link between governmental decision-making and indices of well-being be made more explicit? Can the Minister specifically look at Oxfam's work and the interactive way in which Oxfam is asking members of our society and communities what matters to them? Official recognition of Oxfam's approach, official use of this index, would send out a very clear signal as to our intentions and our values here in Scotland. The values that we use to shape our criteria to measure progress can shape our goals and the country we want to be. I hope we make the right choice. Thank you.
Many thanks. We have a number of members who wish to participate this evening, so speeches of up to 4 minutes, please. Jean Urquhart to be followed by John Park.
Mr Kenneth-Macintosh for bringing this debate to the Chamber tonight. I'm delighted to have the opportunity to speak in favour of this motion and of Oxfam's vital work in this area. As other members will know, it is common for us to receive briefings or points of view from interested parties on the debates we have on the floor, but uncommon for these contributions to be unanimous in their tone. The overwhelming and sincere support for the Humankind-index from groups across Scottish civic society is very welcome and also very telling. For too long now, Scotland and the developed world as a whole has relied upon GDP figures to paint a picture of a prosperous society. However, as Oxfam have succinctly remarked, GDP is, and I quote, consumption-orientated and distribution-blind. A high GDP and endemic and crippling poverty are, sadly, not mutually exclusive, but in fact often go hand in hand, as the growing inequality of the past 30 years in the UK has shown. A reliance on GDP figures and purely economic statistics by policymakers can, in fact, harm the common weal rather than help to ameliorate society's scars. The Oxfam Humankind-index is specifically designed to avoid these statistical pitfalls in measuring the health of our society. And to their credit, Oxfam have gone the extra mile in reaching out to as many parts of the community as possible, involving those on lower incomes that unfortunately feel disengaged with the political process and asking them what really matters in their life. There is a lot for us to learn from this method of consultation and participation, particularly the efforts Oxfam went to in accommodating participants through provision of childcare and expenses. It should come as no surprise to us that the index has shown that for most people, good health, strong communities and a healthy local environment are their priorities. Perhaps the lasting contribution of the index will be for policymakers such as ourselves to reach decisions based on how policies will help these laudable aims rather than purely their effect on the nation's finances. It's vital then in our future policy deliberations, we use the Humankind-index. We've been provided with a tool to help deliver social justice for Scotland, and I hope that we can use it. I support the motion. Thank you.
Many thanks. I now call John Park to be followed by Murdo Fraser.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer, and can I also begin by congratulating Ken-Macintosh on bringing this debate this evening, and also draw attention to my register of interest as a Director of Scotland's Futures Forum, which will probably become apparent as my speech goes on. I think the first thing I'd like to say is that in 2008, and Mr Swinney will remember this, we had a series of debates here in the Parliament when the global financial crisis was starting to unfold. And I think all the parties right across the board accepted that that model had failed, and the things that we had to debate here in the Parliament and the changes that we had to make and the policies we had to develop and the decisions that had to be taken had to have a direct and positive impact on what was happening outside the Parliament. And I think that recognition, regardless of some of the differences that have developed over the years, is still there. And that's why I think this debate that we're having this evening and the issue of the Humankind-index and how we measure the quality of life here in Scotland and more widely across the globe is very, very important. And it may seem like a policy-driven debate or something that politicians can talk about here in Scottish Parliament, but it is something I personally believe, if we start to make these changes and then start to place policy development changes on the back of new measurements and more effective measurements, it will have a direct impact on the lives of the people that we represent. Maybe not tomorrow, maybe not next week, but certainly in the future. And that's why I welcome, in the same way as Ken-Macintosh mentioned earlier in his contribution about the development of the National Performance Framework, although again it is something that I think is a good basis, it's got the foundations. It's something that we haven't really discussed properly here in the Scottish Parliament, I would say, and certainly not in the Chamber. And I believe that the work that we could be taking forward, hopefully shortly in the Economy, Energy and Tourism Committee, looking at the Humankind-index, looking at the National Performance Framework, will give us an opportunity to build some political discourse around how we improve what we measure and make some real changes. So I think this is I'm pleased to be involved in this debate, and I'm also pleased to maybe highlight a little bit more about what Ken-Macintosh mentioned earlier with regards to the work that Scotland's Futures Forum is doing in this area. Although he did have me reaching for my diary, worrying about what I was doing this evening. I don't know if Mr Macintosh said that there was an event on this evening. There will be a Scotland's Futures Forum event on the 19th of September, which is around the Rethinking Wellbeing initiative that the Futures Forum are taking forward just now. There's a whole series of events taken on over the next year. And that's really to get parliamentarians and people outside Parliament to think a little bit differently without the constraints that we sometimes have here with regards to the kind of country that we live in. And I hope parliamentarians will participate in that, and it's something that I hope to be involved in as that series moves forward. Because we need to think about, as I mentioned earlier, the now, we need to think about the medium term, but we also need to be scanning the horizon for the issues that are going to come up in the future and how we develop policy and thinking around that way, and not always constrained by, as I said, some of the issues that we have to deal with here in the Parliament on a day-to-day and a week-to-week basis. I recently moved back to an area in Dunfermline that I grew up in, and the difference there from when I was a young boy growing up there to what it is like now is unbelievable. It's a place that's been redeveloped, regenerated, a lot of investment going into the area. And I'm sure you can measure employment, I'm sure you could measure the income, but one thing we probably can't measure is the difference that community and that environment has made to the people who are living there, and I think that is important to capture that. I can see that.
I'm afraid the member's concluding.
I could see that firsthand. But if we were able to capture that and then make sure that we're developing policies so all the communities can benefit in that way, that's something I'd like to see happen sincerely.
Thank you very much. Murdo Fraser to be followed by Patrick Harvey.
Can I congratulate Ken-Macintosh for securing this debate and commend not just his motion but Oxfam Scotland for the valuable work that they have done in developing the Humankind-index. As other members have mentioned, the Economy, Energy and Tourism Committee, which I have the pleasure of convening, has already done some work looking at this, and we had Catherine Tribeck and Dan Barlow from WWF come to the committee's Business Planning Day the other week to explain more about the background to the Humankind Index. This is an issue we intend to take forward, and we are inviting Joseph Stiglitz to come and speak to the committee, hopefully later this year, so we can dig still further. The background to this issue, as Kenneth-Macintosh fairly said, is a recognition of the imperfections of GDP as a measure of success. The point has been made that because of the way GDP is constructed, it will demonstrate an increase when events occur which may not otherwise be regarded as beneficial. For example, an oil spill in international waters that requires it to be cleaned up will demonstrate an increase in GDP, when very few people would regard that as a positive outcome. And the purpose of the Humankind Index is to try and find other ways of measuring economic success. And this is not only being recognised here, it's being recognised much more broadly. As Kenneth-Macintosh quite fairly recognised, the Prime Minister himself back in 2010 referred to this need to develop new ways of measuring happiness. If I can just quote from a speech he made at that time, the point is that all of life can't be measured on a balance sheet. And no one put that better than Robert Kennedy more than 40 years ago in a fantastic speech. He said that GDP does not allow for the health of our children, the quality of their education, or the joy of their play. It measures neither our wisdom nor our learning, neither our compassion nor our devotion to our country. It measures everything, in short, except that which makes life worthwhile. And the Prime Minister went on to say, just as the GDP figures don't give a full story of our economy's growth, but give us a useful indicator of where we're heading, so I believe a new measure won't give us the full story of our nation's well-being, or our happiness or contentment, or the rest of it. Of course it won't. But it could give us a general picture of whether life is improving, and that does have a really practical purpose. Now, I don't always agree with the Prime Minister. There are many members here who will agree even less with the Prime Minister than I do on most occasions, but I'm sure all of us would agree that that is an objective worth pursuing. And the UK Government has already developed this idea of general well-being, measured for the first time this year. You may be interested to know, Presiding Officer, that nationwide we have an average happiness level of 7.4 out of 10. We can reflect how much happier we are in this chamber than others elsewhere. I believe in Scotland's island communities they are much happier than the rest of us. Now, the Humankind Index is not without its issues. It is inherently subjective. It is based on what people themselves come forward and say are the things that are important to them. Looking at some of the detail of what was presented to us, it seemed to me there was some overlap between the different categories, particularly in relation to issues like work and financial issues. And because of the way it's constructed, it would be difficult to compare internationally with how other countries were performing. But it is nevertheless a valuable piece of work. It's also important to stress that the intention of the Humankind Index is not to replace GDP, but rather to complement it. Kenneth-Macintosh, in his motion, says this is intended to spark debate. I'm not convinced necessarily that the Humankind Index is the answer, but I think we should have a debate about it and a debate about these broad issues. And on that basis, I'm very happy to endorse this motion.
Many thanks. I now call Patrick Harvey to be followed by Marco Biaggi.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. And I'd also like to add my thanks to Kenneth-Macintosh for bringing this motion and for his recognition of the small role that I played, as well as colleagues Linda Fabiani, David Martin from the Labour Party, and also Joe Swinson from the Liberal Democrats, who I expect will be at the Westminster launch of the Humankind Index when that takes place next month. Greens, over the years, have been banging the drum about alternatives to GDP in this chamber and well outside as well. Back in my first session as an MSP, my colleague Mark Ballard hosted an event entitled Measuring What Matters to try and bring some further debate on this issue into the Scottish Parliament. And the Humankind Index is peppered with phrases similar to that, measuring what matters. Greens, I think, come to this first of all from a recognition that everlasting economic growth on a planet of finite resources is first of all unlikely to happen, and secondly, very often harmful when we pursue that at the expense of other things, and that the pursuit of everlasting economic growth has resulted in a situation where the economic benefits, the material benefits of economic growth, have been hoarded by the few or stashed away in tax havens, whereas the social and environmental cost of that economic activity has very often been heaped upon those least able to defend themselves. And so simply increasing the size of the cake, GDP only measures the size of the cake, simply increasing that is not a socially beneficial or environmentally responsible or economically sustainable policy. And if we were to move away from that and think about how the cake is shared, what the cake contains, rather than just the size of it, we would, by definition, have to address questions of distribution, questions of equity, and questions of sustainability. Yes, indeed.
Neil Findlay.
Many of the themes that he's discussed and that have come out in this debate fit in very nicely with the People's Charter, which will soon be becoming before the Parliament in a petition. I'm not 100% sure whether Mr Harvey has signed. I hope he has, but I'm sure he would join me and encourage other members to sign up to the Charter.
Patrick Harvey.
Absolutely, and I'll make every effort to attend the event that I know is taking place soon. Although Greens have been, as I say, making this case for a long time, we're by no means the only ones to do so. Several members have already mentioned the quote from Bobby Kennedy, and I think people mention this quote so often because I've never heard the argument expressed better. And I think it's worth reflecting on one or two other aspects of that quote. Gross national product, as he was describing, counts locks for our doors and jails for those who break them. It counts napalm and counts nuclear weapons and armoured cars for the police to fight the riots in our streets. It counts Whitman's rifle and Speck's knife and the television programmes which glorify violence in order to sell toys to our children. Few people, I think, have expressed this argument better than Kennedy did in that quote. It's rare, Deputy Presiding Officer, that I have the opportunity as well to quote with such relish religious voices in Scotland. But the Church of Scotland's Commission on the Purposes of Economic Activity have made crucial arguments about this as well. We need to recognise, they say, the importance of a right relationship with money, and that what is of value is more than simply money. There are problems caused in society by wealth as well as the lack of it. And they talk about these challenging economic times as an opportunity to re-evaluate the fundamentals. The Humankind-index is by no means the last word on these issues, as other members have mentioned, but it's a very important contribution to this debate, as others have contributed to it as well. And I look forward to the Economy Committee in this Parliament building on that work, continuing scrutiny, and I urge the Government, in looking at how the National Performance Framework develops for the future, to take it very clearly in the direction indicated by the Humankind-index.
Thank you. I now call Marco Biaggi to be followed by Claudia Beamish.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and thank you to Ken-Macintosh for allowing us to be here to debate this. GDP isn't a flawed measure, but it is definitely a limited one. I think perhaps economists are more aware of its ups and downs than those of us who quote it so readily in public discourse. GDP is a quick and dirty measure of economic activity within a country, and is a measure that's been around for about 80 years now. But it was never intended to go beyond that. It has been pressed into service in many roles for which it really wasn't designed. Even just in terms of measuring the size of the cake, as Patrick Harvey points out, there is a rival measure of GNI, gross national income, which measures not the amount of economic activity within a country, but the amount of that economic activity that ultimately accrues to the citizens of that country. For example, in Europe, that tends to be virtually the same as GDP, but when you look at Equatorial Guinea, its GDP of $27,478 per capita is quite impressive by sub-Saharan African standards, but its GNI per capita is 47% lower. It's clear from that indicator that the people of that country are not the sole beneficiaries of its resources. Similarly, you have to adjust for purchasing power parity, because a loaf of bread doesn't cost the same in Blantyre and Lanarkshire as it does in Blantyre and Malawi. And that further introduces the kind of estimations and approximations that really makes social science a very inexact art. And in the past, in the UK, productivity was often an indicator that people looked at in economics. But as GDP growth tended to come from working ever longer hours from the 1980s onwards, it tended to fall out of fashion. But even with an awareness of GDP's strengths and weaknesses, and there are many of them, we do run the risk of losing sight of what it truly means to prosper. This isn't the first attempt to create an alternative or a complement or a supplement to GDP. Amartya Sen, one of the other Nobel Prize winners in economics that perhaps doesn't get as much of a hearing in the UK as Joseph Stiglitz, but was the first Indian Nobel Prize winner in economics, has spent a career trying to develop an alternative paradigm for the whole of economics, centred on what's called the capabilities approach. His famous example is that in the Bengal famine, there was no legal impediment to people buying food, but clearly, although the free market was satisfied, the starving weren't. This led on to the United Nations Development Programme's Humankind-index, which combines literacy, life expectancy and other well-being indicators. And countries there with a high GDP tend to have a high HDI, but the link isn't absolute. One example that is often pointed out is Kerala in India, a state that is one of a kind in having a democratically elected communist government that has nonetheless managed to remain democratically elected for a great many years, and which has always matched developed world levels of health, in particular with only developing world levels of finance. HDI isn't perfect either. It leaves out environmental efficiency, and frankly it gives high scores to those countries that have not very free political systems. All of this comes together to show that these are still a developing process. HDI mimics GDP's strength. It is comparable across countries, whereas humankind is distinctively Scottish. I think that's its greatest strength, as well as a shortcoming that it is distinctive to the priorities of people in Scotland that participated in its development. And while it's unlikely to be the last word in this issue, I think it is the first, and a very useful reminder that progress has more than one dimension.
Thank you very much. At this stage, I must inform the Chamber that due to the number of members who still wish to speak in the debate, I'm minded to accept a motion from Ken-Macintosh under Rule 8.14.3 that the debate be extended by up to 15 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I move a motion without notice to extend the debate by up to 15 minutes?
You may indeed. Thank you. Is the Chamber agreed? Thank you very much. I now call Claudia Beamish.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. It is significant that this members' debate has been called today by Ken-Macintosh, and the strength of cross-party support that it has enhanced, and support beyond this chamber. This is just one of the many ways in which an essential shift is happening in Scotland and elsewhere. I fully endorse the aims and sentiments articulated in Ken-Macintosh's motion, and the principles underpinning the Humankind-index, which alter the focus of our economic attention. Why do we so badly need an alternative measure or measures? GDP is, of course, the market value of all officially recognised final goods and services produced within a country in a given period. In this way, it is often considered an indicator of the country's standard of living. But is this really an accurate and meaningful indicator of a country's standard of living? Many strongly disagree. Many in this chamber today have mentioned the Senator Bobby Kennedy's famous speech, which is indeed stirring and important stuff. Perhaps the most significant thing that I want to say about the speech is that although it was spoken 40 years ago at the University of Kansas, there are few countries, although there are exceptions to this, that have actually adopted these indicators 40 years later. WWF Scotland believes, and I quote, that the pursuit of GDP growth alone risks undermining progress in other areas key to securing a flourishing and sustainable Scotland, and that GDP neither accounts for the depletion of natural capital, nor does it distinguish between expenditure that is positive or negative. An example of this being hospital admissions due to air pollution. This shows that as an expenditure, it doesn't highlight that the expenditure is something that we'd rather not incur. It has been commented that the business community would be opposed to measuring anything other than a direct calculation of capital as GDP is now. However, economists the world over have begun to accept that GDP ignores changes in natural, social and human components of capital on which a country relies for continued existence and for its future well-being. In business terms, this means that things like calculating the cost of depleting resources is rarely factored into budgeting, which will lead in the long run to unsustainable business practices. Thus, an index that measures more than simply the gross product will be a help to business rather than a hindrance. The political engagement of our communities is at the heart of this issue, and as a community activist teacher and now MSP, I'm keenly aware of some of what matters to challenged communities, such as ex-mining communities in the Douglas Valley in my own region, affordable warm housing and many of the other issues that have been raised, such as fresh air and living in a clean and healthy environment, raised by other members today and stressed by Oxfam, and reinforced by a range of organisations from Scottish Wildlife Trust to the Poverty Alliance, are all essential if we were to move forward in a positive way for the people of Scotland. Many communities are looking to change collectively through transition towns and many other initiatives. In the words of the Poverty Alliance, we must be aware that treating people as passive recipients of policies rather than potential active agents of change is not the right way forward for Scotland. People's voices matter, and we must listen. If people are to engage more with the political system, quarterly reporting announced alongside GDP on issues that matter to the people of Scotland, reported in a comprehensible way, which is broken down into some of the headline measures, would surely help with these connections between politicians and policymakers and the communities that we represent. A start could be 2 or 3 of the following, chosen in dialogue with communities, giving more prominence to the distribution of income, consumption and wealth, or reporting on proximity to dangerous levels of environmental damage, or security of employment, or indeed mental health and well-being. These and other measures, in dialogue with communities, should inform the Scottish Government's budget, direction of government at all levels, policy and action, and the interface and development and refinement of the national performance indicators, which I look forward to accepting the invitation with Mr Swinney to discuss, is also essential.
You must conclude.
Thank you. It really is only to say that the time for these alternatives has come, and I know that we will move forward on this issue. Thank you.
Many thanks. I now call Roderick Campbell to be followed by Drew Smith.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Like others, I congratulate Ken-Macintosh on securing this debate for members' business. I welcome the publication of the first results from Oxfam's Humankind-index project. Indeed, it must be the case that the term gross domestic product has very little meaning for people who live and work out with the professions of politics and economics. Certainly not instantly obvious what it encompasses. Indeed, it has also been said in the briefing for the debate by the Poverty Alliance, there is a very real problem with people on low income feeling that politics and the decisions made and the economic impact of those decisions are a distant activity in which they have little chance of making any meaningful contribution. It's also certainly revealing, if not surprising, that in terms of community spirit, more deprived areas, as the Humanitarian Index indicates, lag seriously behind, and also in terms of the numbers of people in those communities who are volunteers. Presiding Officer, it simply isn't true that the success of a nation's economy can be judged by the trade of paid goods and services alone. I'm sure all of us in the Chamber can agree upon that. Nevertheless, there can be no doubt that GDP as a measure will remain an important tool, but its shortcomings also need to be appreciated, not least its lack of focus on real outcomes from the spending that is included in its calculation. The Scottish Wildlife Trust is by no means alone in pointing out that spending in one area to counter the negative side effects of activity in another area is not growth in any sensible use of the word. Accordingly, I very much welcome this new index as a complement to GDP. Indeed, that is how Oxfam describe it in their conclusion. A wide variety of measurements will in itself offer a more focused picture on how Scotland is performing. On that subject, I'm pleased that the Scottish Government takes seriously the requirement to gather and analyse economic data in an effective way to enable effective policy decisions to be made across the range of government portfolios. Ken-Macintosh and John Park have referred to the National Performance Framework Scotland Performs, and I quote, it's described as the result of an innovative and thoughtful approach to calculating progress, and the Scottish Government and all other non-governmental bodies across business, local government and the third sector deserve praise for their work in establishing Scotland Performs. Those aren't my words, those are the findings of the Carnegie Trust and the Sustainable Development Commission in a report published last May. Presiding Officer, what matters is subjective. Many business owners will tell you that growth and profit is what matters most to the economy, financial viability. On the other hand, when a typical Scottish family is asked what matters to them, they are probably unlikely to mention growth or profit. That is not to say that their well-being is not firmly entwined with the private sector's success, but it certainly demonstrates that the needs and aspirations of Scots vary enormously. When consulted as individuals by the Humankind-index, people made it clear what is most important to them. Health and housing issues are at the top, although if you have no job, both may be affected. I congratulate Ken-Macintosh once again for securing this debate, and I look forward to seeing how this index develops in the coming years.
Many thanks. And now I call Drew Smith.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. It is customary to congratulate members on securing these debates and to remark upon the importance of what is being discussed. And this is a custom which is largely followed regardless of whether the topic being debated is actually of any real interest or relevance to any of us beyond the constituencies and regions or beyond the constituencies and regions of only a handful of members. However, on this occasion, Ken-Macintosh has brought forward a debate which is not just relevant, timely, interesting and important, but potentially revolutionary, if Mr Macintosh will forgive me for calling him names. The congratulations should also go to Oxfam for the work that they have done and for the way in which they have brought their ideas to public prominence. Oxfam describes the Humankind-index as being about valuing the things that really matter to the people of Scotland, including social relations, health and skills, physical environment, natural context and financial assets. These ideas are not uniquely Oxfam's, but they are part of a wider and growing movement in research, presentation of information and campaigning, which seeks to challenge the way in which we value the real wealth in the world around us. Similar ideas have been expressed around the creation and maintenance of more equal societies, and broader measurements are critical to being able to genuinely understand and promote preventative spending measures. As Ken-Macintosh said, it is welcome that even the UK coalition, not a government known for doing much to actually promote well-being, have at least signalled their intention to begin measuring the very things to which they are doing so much damage. The Scottish Government's own Scotland Performs system is a welcome but limited example of the ideas being taken up by the state. And like Mr Macintosh and Mr Park, I'm not yet convinced that the measurements made by that process are genuinely driving policy choices in Scotland. Yet I am hopeful that it will become increasingly more useful. And indeed, I also hope that the suggestions made by Oxfam and supported by an impressive list of others for changes to the National Performance Framework have been taken on board, and I'm sure that the Cabinet Secretary may say more about that in closing. It is a sign of the widespread interest and appeal in these measures that so many organisations have, as others have said, sent members briefings for this debate, including, as Patrick Harvey reminds us, importantly the Church, but also the voluntary sector and trade unions. Conversations around better and more real forms of measuring success and lack of success are commonplace in the voluntary and campaigning sector and amongst also health promoters, of which I used to be one. The Labour movement and before that the anti-slavery movement grew out of ideas that people were worth very much more than their productivity as workers. For the left, it can, in my view, be too easy to glibly accept initiatives like Humankind and assume that they simply reinforce our own worldview. In fact, the challenge is just as much to us and others like us who believe in decent work as a route to a better life. At this time, when, as the Humankind-index tells us, 43% of Scots report a fall in their personal sense of financial security, job creation is a vital responsibility of government, and the view that promoting economic growth, as measured by GDP, creates a challenge for us. Reducing all policy decisions to what is best for growth can become about what is best for business or best for government. The Humankind-index encourages us to remember that the creation of a better country means better lives for people, not just a long dance with powerful and persuasive interests, justified on the grounds of job creation. Oxfam Scotland describes the Humankind-index as measuring what makes a good life. At the beginning of a new session and on a day when we have been debating the Scottish Government's legislative programme, Ken-Macintosh has done the Scottish Parliament a service by bringing this debate this evening.
Many thanks. I would now like to invite the Cabinet Secretary to respond to the debate. So I call on John Swinney, and you have around 7 minutes, Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and it is indeed a pleasure to close this debate and to respond to the issues that have been raised by Ken-Macintosh and other members in the course of the debate. And can I associate myself, but not in the cynical way, with in such a way for such a young man as Drew Smith, genuinely with the motion that Ken-Macintosh has put forward tonight, because I think it does open up an interesting debate within Parliament, and it gives us the opportunity to explore some very substantial points which I think have broad agreement across the Parliamentary Chamber that can enhance the way in which we assess and consider public policy within Scotland. When Ken-Macintosh started his contribution by his reference to the exams difficulty in 2000, and the difficulties for the SQA, and the fact that universities generally took a view during that difficulty that exam results didn't really matter. I wish I'd had the same knowledge in 1980, 81 and 82, when I was in fact awaiting a certificate which had at the bottom of the certificate the signature of Mr Macintosh's distinguished late father. As the chairman of the Scottish Exam Board, I'm afraid I preceded the SQA and was involved in O grades and all the rest of it, but the exam certificate was nonetheless welcome when it eventually arrived with that distinguished signature on it. This debate is a fascinating one, because I think it gives us an opportunity, and certainly me as an opportunity as a minister in the government, to actively promote the work of the National Performance Framework that the government has followed since 2007, and essentially to invite and encourage a debate around the effectiveness of that National Performance Framework, and to encourage greater awareness about it as it begins to address some of the aspirations that are clearly contained in the Index of Humankind, which has been developed by Oxfam, and which I think aims to do, or certainly I would reverse the order of that, the National Performance Framework, in my opinion and my aspiration, aims to do what the Index of Humankind that is proposed by Oxfam is trying to do. And I don't make that remark from a sort of defensive government minister point of view. It's a genuine point that I think we've tried in the National Performance Framework to construct an analysis of national performance, which isn't just a report card about the government. It's about all sorts of things, about how people live their lives, how they want to live their lives, what their aspirations happen to be, what their hopes are within our society, and to test whether or not, as a country, we are making progress year on year, month by month, to achieving that picture. And that's at the heart of our thinking behind the National Performance Framework. I'll give way to Mr Harvey.
Patrick Harvey.
I'm grateful to the Cabinet Secretary, and I accept and agree with what he says about the intention of the National Performance Framework, and I very much welcome, for example, the inclusion of solidarity and cohesion and sustainability targets within it. But does the Cabinet Secretary acknowledge that there remains a strong perception that GDP is at the top of a hierarchy in the National Performance Framework? If the intention is not to place GDP at the top of a hierarchy, is there not a need to refresh and reframe the way that the performance framework is presented and understood in its application in government, in Parliament and in the wider society?
John Swinney.
I suppose that point gets to, in a sense, I suppose, the nub of some of the difference of opinion that might exist around the National Performance Framework. This government has made a choice that we believe at the top of our priorities should be an improvement in the economic performance of Scotland. We came to that view in 2007, before the financial crash of 2008, and I think there's pretty broad agreement in the Chamber that if it wasn't relevant in 2007, it certainly was relevant post-2008. But throughout all of our discussions, and Mr Harvey and I, of course, have chewed over this point privately and publicly on many, many occasions, it's not growth at any price. It's growth within a context of, as Mr Harvey quite rightly says, a range of other factors, balancing factors, I would say, of participation in the economy, of solidarity, of cohesion, of ensuring that we deliver regional equity between different parts of the country. Crucially, that we take due account of the questions of sustainability and our utilisation
of natural resources. So the National Performance Framework is an attempt to bring together all of those factors. And when I look at some of the aspects of the index of humankind put forward by Oxfam, of certain factors such as physical and mental health or affordable, decent and safe homes, I see approaches reflecting those aspirations very clearly in the national outcomes that are part of the National Performance Framework. So my response to the debate in Parliament tonight is really a welcome invitation to members in all parts of the Chamber to work with us on ensuring the strength and the effectiveness and, crucially, the longevity of the National Performance Framework. We have developed in Scotland something which was assessed by the Carnegie Trust and the Sustainable Development Commission, as my colleague Rod Campbell has just said, has been described as the most innovative and forward-thinking attempt since devolution to track Scotland's progress and performance. I think we should be proud of that, but we should also be prepared to build on that. And that's the invitation I essentially put out to Parliament tonight, that ministers will be delighted to discuss across the parliamentary chamber the way that we take this forward. The Carnegie Trust indicated that the one concern they had, or one of the concerns they had about the National Performance Framework, was that they were concerned that through the ebb and flow of politics, there is a significant risk of all this expertise being lost and the framework itself being abandoned now or in the future. Now, this government has maintained that framework from its first term to its second term. Heaven forfend if this government was ever to be replaced by an administration of a different colour. I would like to think, in that utterly unlikely event, that the National Performance Framework would be retained as a long-term measure of how the country is developing, enhanced, of course, by the debate we can have across the Parliament Chamber, by the debate and scrutiny that the Enterprise and Tourism, the Economy and Tourism Committee will be able to give to this process, and which has undoubtedly been enhanced by the work of Oxfam and the debate that Mr Macintosh has led tonight.
Many thanks, and that concludes Ken Macintosh's debate on the Humankind Index, and I now close this meeting of Parliament.